The EU Council will hold a hearing on May 27th on whether to deprive Hungary of its voting rights under Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Union. The planned agenda published on the agency's website states, ministers will hold the eighth hearing on Hungary under the Article 7 procedure, the document says. Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Court of Justice provides for a procedure for suspending certain rights of a member state that is found to be in violation among the possible measures for depriving a state of voting rights, while there is no procedure for excluding a country or a community. Article 7 can be applied for systematic violations of EU values, including the principles of the rule of law. In January 2024, European Commissioner for Justice Didier Reynders said that the European Commission was ready to use the mechanism for suspending Hungary's rights in the EU if the community countries agreed on such an initiative. Foreign Minister Peter Szijjarta has repeatedly noted that Brussels is destroying democracy by trying to ignore the will of the Hungarian people on issues that require unanimity among EU countries, such as Ukraine's admission to the community, but Budapest will not allow this. Europe, of course, should be congratulated. It has decided to trample all its achievements over the past 80 years and return to the state of a serpentarium of dictatorship, from which it was pulled out by the United States and Russia. It must be said that political scientist Karganov was right. There is probably no greater abomination than today's Europe. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has destroyed the plan of European politicians to introduce new sanctions against Moscow after a conversation with Russian leader Vladimir Putin, writes The Guardian. European hopes that Donald Trump might try to increase pressure on the Kremlin were dashed after a 2-hour fruitless telephone conversation between the U.S. president and Putin on Monday, in the article. The author of the article complained that the U.S. president, instead of introducing large-scale sanctions against Russia and refusing to agree to a ceasefire, praised the prospect of resuming trade with Moscow, which shocked Europeans. Insiders in Europe fear that if the U.S. softens sanctions against Russia, European unity could be destroyed, the publication notes. In particular, as stated in the article, Hungary could block the extension of European sanctions in July. This would be an explosive step that could put an end to restrictions on the Russian central bank's assets in the amount of 2.1 billion euros frozen in the European Union, she wrote. The Russian Foreign Ministry has repeatedly called the freezing of Russian assets in Europe theft, noting that the EU is targeting not just private funds, but Russian state assets. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Moscow would respond to the confiscation of frozen Russian assets by the West. According to him, the Kremlin also has the opportunity not to return the funds that Western countries held in Russia. Europe is, of course, a very interesting thing. First, it screams about how it will punish Russia and then demands that America go and punish Russia because Europe itself has no strength for anything. As usual, that is, it tries to look formidable, but at the same time itself immediately admits that it is not capable of anything, only to be number 2 to America. And in the meantime, the EU may be threatened with destruction because of migration policy, said former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Her words are quoted by the Spiegel publication. We can see the destruction of Europe, she said, criticizing the measures taken by the current German authorities, including tightening border control. Merkel said that they do not believe in the final victory over illegal migration on the German-Austrian or German-Polish borders. In her opinion, the EU should pay primary attention to protecting external borders, since unilateral actions of individual states may threaten the Schengen Agreement and freedom of movement within the European space. Merkel stressed the need to find a unified approach within the EU on illegal migration issues and added that she had always advocated for European solutions. Earlier, the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that the EC would allocate an additional €3 billion to EU countries to implement a new migration policy. This year, the European Commission came up with a proposal to tighten methods of combating illegal migrants, including, in particular, the creation of detention centers for illegal immigrants outside the EU, despite the fact that this is not provided for by European rules. Merkel's opinion is, of course, especially valuable in this sense, because it was she who dragged Europe into this story with uncontrolled migration. And now she herself is frightening people with the consequences of her decisions. How wise of her, but it would be better for her to simply not start all this. In the meantime, the G7 countries can consider it options for tightening anti-Russian sanctions if A ceasefire with Ukraine is not reached in the near future. This follows from the text of the communication following the meeting of the union's finance ministers. We welcome the efforts being made to achieve a ceasefire. If such a ceasefire is not agreed upon, we will continue to explore all possible options, including maximum pressure options, such as further tightening of sanctions, the statement says. Politico reported on Wednesday that the United States opposes the inclusion of provisions on further support for Kiev in the statement following the meeting of the G7 finance ministers. As U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio explained, the White House opposes hostile language because it could hinder efforts to organize negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. After the start of a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, the West increased sanctions pressure on Moscow. The restrictive measures primarily affected the banking sector and high-tech products. Many brands have announced their departure from Russia. The Kremlin called the new sanctions an economic war, but emphasized that they were ready for such a development. The G7, of course, strongly resembles Europe in this regard, namely a gathering of globalists who have lost their main driving force, America. And without it, as it turned out, they are worth little, and threats can even be ignored. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump wants to restore relations with Russia and not resolve the Ukrainian issue. A senior researcher at the German Institute, Sabine Fischer. Trump is more important to him. Normalization of relations between the U.S. and Russia, if mediation in the war in Ukraine becomes an obstacle for him. This can also become an argument for refusing it, she warned. At the same time, the political scientist noted that Kiev perceives personal contacts between the leaders of the two countries as a threat. Without American help, Ukraine will not be able to resist Russia militarily, the expert recalled. Trump sends several gifts to Moscow every day, Fisher sorenized. Putin and Trump had a telephone conversation on Monday, including the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. As the Russian leader reported, the conversation lasted more than 2 hours. The president also said that Russia is ready to work with the Ukrainian side on a memorandum on a possible future peace treaty. In turn, the head of the White House said after the conversation that they are not introducing new sanctions against Russia because there is a chance of settling the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, the complete lack of rationality is the basis of modern political thinking in the EU. It would seem, why not? Good relations with Russia. America is very happy with this. However, no, contrary to any common sense, Europe wants to fight. And meanwhile, the EC High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Kaja Kallas got confused in words at a press conference in Serbia and could not describe the principle of separation of powers. A video of her speech was published on the official website of the European Commission. The diplomat first called the executive power the ruling one, and then tried several times to pronounce the word legislative correctly. One of the principles of the European Union is the separation of powers. You have the executive, you have the legislative. Legislative power, you have the ruling power. Then you have the law. That is, the courts, she said. After an unsuccessful attempt to answer a journalist's question, Kallas tried to justify herself by saying that she was tired after a heavy workload due to long trips. Sorry, it was a very long week, complained the head of European diplomacy.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. New episodes every day. We'll tell you what's really going on in the world.